Hello and welcome to NARC Live on Wednesday the 22nd of February 2023, coming to you live from Norfolk on the east coast of England with Tammy M0TC.
Hello.
And me, David G7RP. Lovely to see you. On tonight's show, Frank K4FMH joins us to discuss the transmit quality in modern transceivers. This ex-government surplus could be dangerous. And we find out what on earth this is. Do you know what, Tammy? I've been itching to give them a clue.
Have you?
Itching to, yeah.
You were itching to last time, weren't you?
Was I? Yeah, I didn't say anything then because you'd hit me. Anyway, if you have an idea of what this is and you haven't already entered, you can do that on BATC or Facebook, and we'll include that when we get round to that part of the programme. So first, it's club news time. And as you may have seen in the last newsletter, our NARC secretary and member Chris G0DWV is on the organising committee for the World Radio Sport Team Championship 2026. It will basically be like having lots of field day stations around the area, Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex and Cambridgeshire, hosting hams from around the world for a 24-hour contest. So chances are there'll be one close to where you live, or at least within an easy travelling distance. And Chris's team are looking for people interested in getting involved at all the sites, and it's lots of fun. Although 2026 sounds an awful long way away, and I suppose it is really, but they need to know who is interested by the end of this month. That's the end of February. So to add your name and to find out more, see the newsletter and the club's website. And if you want to see a bit more about what the WRTC do, we've got a link here we can show you as well. All of these details are actually on the latest newsletter and also on the front page of our website. So you can see Chris's article there, and that tells you much more. But if you're interested in taking part in this, it's only 3 years away, then please get in touch with his team, send them a quick email before the end of February. But lovely for us to be and have a local connection and be involved. Now, also talking about the club, and this coming Wednesday, we've got our first sort of in-person presentation meeting that we've had for years, literally since before COVID, when of course all our presentations pretty much were in person. And this Wednesday, the 1st of March, so it's a week tonight, we have got a representative from the RSGB coming to tell us about Brickworks. Well, Brickworks is a scheme run by local amateur radio clubs that have committed to helping all licensed amateur radio operators discover what the hobby has to offer. These Brickworks accredited clubs are welcoming and friendly places that will support both those new to the hobby and also those who are already licensed who want to explore the hobby more fully. So if you're an M7 or M6 or an M3, or even you're just someone who doesn't get around to doing much about radio, this is going to be interesting for you. They'll give advice, guidance and help. And they'll also work with their Brickworks participants and provide them with a refuge when things go a little wrong. Now, when I say they actually mean the RSGB, mean us as a club, because we've got to support people out there, our members, and other clubs from around the Norfolk area as well will also be there on Wednesday to hear this presentation. But whether you're a trainer or whether you're a newish licensee, maybe just did it over the COVID years and you haven't really done much in practice, or you're interested in helping your club deliver this Brickworks, then please come along on Wednesday. It's an open invitation. You don't have to be a member of Norfolk Amateur Radio Club or anything. We do normally ask people to be members if you're coming to the school to CNS, but you don't have to be for this. It's an open invitation to anybody in the area to come and see us. So it's the 1st of March, a week tonight, and that talk will start at about 7:45. Now, in fact, talking about the club, there's quite a lot of things to look forward to. And a few new dates for you for your diary, and I'll give you a summary in a little while with all these things on it, but I'm going to go through them all now for you because they're interesting things which hopefully some of you will like to get involved with. Firstly, I'm going to tell you about Super Science Saturday, which is on Saturday the 11th of March between 11 and 3 at CNS. Now, this is a public event which they tend to run in Science and Engineering Week, and this year's no exception. And they do it open to the public, open to their own students and anybody who's interested in science. And again, Norfolk Amateur Radio Club have been invited to put on a display. In fact, the very last time the club displayed, and in fact the last event we did, believe it or not, before COVID was this in 2020, wasn't it, Tammy? It was literally the last thing we did. We didn't even meet again in the school. after this. So what we're after is some volunteers, but ideally volunteers with ideas as well. If you've got a particular aspect of the hobby that you like, whether it's making something, whether it's a particular mode, we'll have some display boards with Morse and things there. We'll have some working radios, of course, as well. But we'd love to put on a display showing people a sample of what this hobby is all about, because there aren't too many technical hobbies that people can get involved with. Most of the visitors, it has to be said, are young people, but often with their parents, and they're often looking for a hobby to get engaged with. So if that's something that you think you can help the club put on, as I said, it's not too far away really, the 11th of March, then please talk to me or any other committee member about, as soon as you can, about what you think you can do for that. And that's the address to write to. As always, it's radio@dcpmicro.com. Next, I want to tell you about something that's happening on Wednesday the 29th of March. And I know that many of you are involved in the Raspberry Pi Jam, which we've had to limit the numbers now. There's no more, nobody else can do it. Now that's going to happen on that night. But also on that night, I'm pleased to say that the NARC construction group is going to be meeting for its first time. Some of you have put your name down. You're interested in building the amplifier for a magnetic loop. And we now have enough people to make that viable. And I've talked to Mark G0TMT, whose idea it was to put that project forward. And he'll be there to meet with hopefully all of you interested in that group. And I will be emailing you as well. And that's on Wednesday the 29th of March. Now, something's very important in every organisation's calendar is their annual general meeting. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't often go to, well, I've never been, in fact, to say my building society AGM or whatever, because they can be quite boring affairs. But ours at NARC, we try them not to be. And we did have one last year, although it was still a little bit under some restrictions, COVID we were just coming out of. But this year we'll be back to normal. And it is on April the 5th, Wednesday, April the 5th, starts at 7 o'clock. Now, as well as the awards and as well as reviewing the year and electing new officers and committee members to run your club, we're also on that night going to be having our construction competition live. And what we're asking you to do is, between now and then, it's about 6 weeks in fact, if you've made anything ever, it doesn't have to be something you've made, or indeed you want to make something in the next few weeks, and you'd like to bring it along to enter into the competition, you could do so, and you'll put it on display there, and the judge of the competition, who is last time's winner, which is actually Mark G0TMT, he will judge the entries that are there. And for everybody else, it'll be something really interesting to look at. So what we're going to do is start the AGM itself at 8 o'clock, but that gives a full hour between 7 and 8 for people who've got something to enter into the competition to put them on display and let others have a look at, as well as the judging as well. So we hope that will make it an exciting evening, and it really will be. The award that we will announce that night, the judge will announce that night, will be absolutely up to the moment. So we hope you'll take part in that. So a reminder again, anything that you've made yourself that's to do with radio or electronics, you just need to have made it yourself really. And the only other thing the only other limitation is it mustn't have won the construction competition with us before, but it could be something that you've entered before. And we hope to put on a varied display. It could be a simple little commercial kit that you've bought for a few pounds, or it could be something really extensive. What the judge will be looking for is good assembly, good craft skills, basically, because that's what construction is all about. So I hope that many of you will make that evening one to remember by bringing your projects that you've made, either already or ones that you're going to make in the next 6 weeks, and you'll make our AGM a really good evening with that. Now, the other thing, because it's an AGM, we'll be making various awards. And we've had, believe it or not, I think it's 36 talks, Tammy, in the last year, did you say? Because you helped do the form, didn't you?
I can't remember how many
it was. It's 30 odd. Anyway, it's a lot of talks that we've had during 2022, last year. And because you're watching this, there's a good chance that you'll have seen some of those, and we would like you to vote. If you're a Norfolk Amateur Radio Club member, you do need to be a paid-up member. We would love you to enter. It's very, very easy. Tammy, now, if you just show us our website, we did put it on the newsletter. This is just a copy. This is literally live now, our website. You can see it says AGM and Speaker of the Year. It's your award, and this is because you, the viewers, will vote for this. So, Tammy, do you want to click that little link there?
Yeah.
Which says Speaker of the Year 2022 voting form. Now, this is as easy as it gets. It will not ask you for any personal information except for your name and your call sign, which is hardly private. And as you can see, there's a list of all of the talks that we did last year. And it's your opportunity to vote for which one. So Tammy, do you want to just click one at random?
Yeah, click any one.
And you can change it, can't you?
Yeah.
You can only vote for one. You do need to be a paid member of NARC. Then you put in your name.
What's my name?
Have you forgotten? And then your last name. And then the call sign. And then you just confirm underneath that. This says, confirm that you are a current paid NARC member and you have only voted once.
Submit.
And then just press submit. And
I'm
that's
not
it.
going to press submit because I voted.
All right. And that's all you have to do. Please, for the sake of all those people who've given us talks, nearly every single one, apart from one, do it completely free of charge. So let's give them a pat on the back for the one that you all think is the best. It's very, very easy to do. You just click on the one you like, you want to vote for, and then enter your name. Please do that. You've got a few weeks to do it. You've got until the end of March, so you've got just over a month's time. But please do it. The link will be on this week's newsletter as well. Now, another event that's happening, which we've been running for several years, then we had to stop with COVID. We did do it last year, but it's coming up again, and that's Saturday, April the 22nd, and it's International Marconi Day. And once again, the club will be putting on a station from Caister Lifeboat Station, which has got a lot of history associated with Marconi. And we've always had this as a really nice event. So at the moment, all you need to do is put it in your diary, the date, and then Steve G0KY, who was organising the event, will start drawing up a roster a little bit nearer the time. But that's Saturday, April the 22nd, about 8 weeks' time. And then finally, another date for your diary, which I know you want to put in, because I know we've already been asked for the date. I can now confirm that the Barford Radio Rally, our Norfolk Amateur Radio Club radio rally that we hold nearly every year, is on Sunday, July the 2nd. And that will be open to the public between 9 and 1 o'clock. If you're a trader, you'll be able to get there from 8 o'clock. But the magic thing to do is to put in your diary July the 2nd. Tammy, can we put that slide up, please? Yeah. Which we did earlier on. So there's all of the dates and the times for everything I've just mentioned. I'm sorry they took a while, but most of those have not been published before. Most of those things are brand new, and we wanted to use NARC Live to tell you all about them. Now, I'll also be reproducing this, copying it and putting it into an article on its own on our website and on the newsletter, along with the other talks and things that are coming up in the next month or so. But they're important dates that I think for many of you, you'll want to make a note of at least one of those. So I hope that's been useful. Now, we've had one piece of news from somebody this week, and that's from Paul, G3VPT. Now, we showed this picture at the beginning of the show, and if we can have a look at it now, Tammy, it might give... I'm not sure if you'll be able to read all of that, but I'll just give you a bit of an introduction, a flavour from it, from Paul. He says this may interest some of our older members because this RF-25 unit was part of the World War II GEE navigation system and was still in use into the 1950s. It's similar to LORAN, which you may have heard of. It's a 3-valve front end with an IF output 7.5 megahertz and was often used as a tunable IF into a suitable receiver to tune frequencies that were not available on the main receiver. These were often World War II surplus sets with limited frequency coverage and homebrew AM transmitters. And there's various models, 20 to 85 megs. He says that, this is Paul said this, I think Roger may have used some of them. And he uses the RF-27 model to receive 4 meters AM. Now, the key thing, you think, what's the relevance of this when I said it could be dangerous? And that is that some of these items, and if you can read some of that story there, you'll know that they actually, because they were using sensitive for the time technology, if they fell into enemy hands, they didn't want the enemy to find out what all this technology was inside. So they have explosives built in. Wow. And yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? And that article there, which is from the RSGB Bulletin, which is the old name for Radcom, from June 1948, was warning people, of course, that time there were lots of surplus on the market, lots of surplus electronics. We're just warning people to be very careful about what you get and to be very careful about opening it. Apparently most of them do have warnings on them. Now, it's probably not something that's completely relevant much today, but there probably is this sort of thing lying around, and there are detonators and charges in some of them. So a very interesting article anyway, Paul. I'd never thought about it before, but quite logical, isn't it? If you don't want your technology to fall into the enemy hands. They also called an IFF transceiver when I did a little bit of homework on it myself, and that stands for identification friend or foe. So watch it out if you've got get some surplus electronics. Just have a look for any warnings like that. Anyway, enough talking from me. Over to Tammy for Little People.
Yep, here's Little People this week. Have you ever wondered what happens to all those old cameras that you've got?
Me personally, or everybody?
Anybody.
Well, oh, that looks good.
They actually turned into water fountains.
That is good, isn't it? Yeah, that zoom lens. Oh, I suppose they do still make cameras. I've got a little Canon camera like that at home somewhere. But when did we last use it?
I know, that's the thing.
I mean, even
it?
SLRs we don't use much, do we? We've got a decent SLR between us, a DSLR. And the phones are so good now. But anyway, that is certainly a good use for an old traditional camera. Thank you very much for picking that. Miniature-calendar.com is where we get those pictures from. There's a new one every day, and Tammy picks one for us. Thank you, Tammy. So, what have you been doing? Please keep in touch. Stories like Paul's or anything in your radio hobby, or even something you just think will be of interest to viewers, then please let us know. Send us an email to this address, radio@dcpmicro.com. Obviously, we only meet approximately every other Wednesday now, but whenever you send it to us, as long as you send it to us by 3 o'clock on the Wednesday of transmission, then we'll be sure to use it. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much. So now round to that competition. And we asked you a couple of weeks ago, what on earth is this? And
We
as I
have
said,
had a couple of extra answers.
have you? Okay.
Yeah.
What, the ones where I said I was itching to give them a clue?
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Mike G8EEY says he thinks it looks like a knit comb.
Oh.
And Andy M0NKR says he thinks it's a flea comb.
Okay, knits, fleas, are they similar? Well, let's see what you thought at home. Thanks for those entries, guys. David M6DPZ says, is it a vintage knit comb or a device to defluff clothes? Well, make your mind up, David. I think I'd want to know which one.
Kevin M0UJD, I believe this is a flea or knit comb with the closed teeth which allows...
Sorry, I'm sorry.
You
Sorry
should
about
have told me
that.
that and I could have muted your mic.
I'm sorry, yep. That came quickly.
I think it is a flea or knit comb with closed teeth which allows hair or fur through but stops the fleas and knits.
Oh,
it's lovely, isn't it?
Just had a meal as well. Richard M6UES says, looks like a comb used on pets. Our cat used to have one which looked like this.
Tony M0TDK, I think this week's mystery object is a profile or contour gauge. The pins slide in when you press it against the thing you want to copy, such as a moulding or cornice, and then allows you to have a copy of the profile.
Oh, yes. Maybe. Bob G6PWS says, this week's what if is a knit comb, very thin teeth, to detach the knits and their eggs from hair. Oh, this is a lot of information. My wife has to remove the knits from my granddaughter's long head of hair every weekend. Her school class is rife with them. Yeah, anyway, I can't read the next bit. I just realised what that says. I think we better move on. But thank you, Bob, for that entry.
Bruce G4KZT, I reckon this week's mystery object is a flea comb for pets.
And Phil G4LPP says, this looks like a pet flea comb. I've some recent experience. Brackets, please don't read that out. I don't think they know.
Pete G0FVG says it is a knit comb.
Tom G8XQD says, looks very much to me like a knit comb.
Sorry, I've lost where I was because I looked at the screen.
That's all right. Nick.
Where are we?
Here we are.
Nick, 2E0IBP. It looks either like a flea comb or a knit comb, so I'm going to say knit comb.
And finally, Steve G3EVA says, is the latest what on earth is this, a pet comb? If not, it would certainly make a good job of grooming Alfie. So lots of entries, most of them saying what they thought it was. Tammy will now reveal what it is.
It is
Okay.
a knit comb.
But it could have been one of those profiling things.
Yeah, I must admit, I like where Tony was going with that.
Yeah.
One of the things where you get the real things that...
Anyway, Nev M0NFY sent us that. Thank you very much for all your entries online or on email. Let's give you another challenge. Now, this is a good one.
This again.
I'll be surprised. I'm going to stick my neck out here. Apart from the person who sent it in, I'll be surprised if anybody gets this. So there, rise to the challenge and tell us what on earth is this?
I think people will.
Do you?
Yeah, I do.
So it's some kind of tool, isn't it? And that's all we can say. And if you knew it was from, that would give you a clue, so we're not going to tell you. Anyway, this is the item. It's a tool, isn't it, for something. What on earth is it? What are those things? And what is it for? Send your answers to that address, radio@dcpmicro.com. 2 weeks, just under 2 weeks today. 3 o'clock on 2 weeks on Wednesday. And we will then reveal that evening what it is. I don't think anybody's going to get it. You do?
Yeah, I do.
Do you?
Do you have a fiver on it?
You can't see. Oh, you did see it. Okay. Damn, he saw it. That's a witness now.
Thank you.
Do you take cash or is it
Yeah,
PayPal
cash,
now and all that
yeah,
stuff?
thank
Yeah?
you, yeah.
Contactless? Clueless? Clueless, probably. Anyway, better move on because we're keeping our guests waiting. This is just time to tell you what's happening on the club this week. On Sunday at 7 o'clock, it's the GB Torres News on GB3MB. On Monday, it's the Monday Night Net on GB3MB at 7:30. And at 8 o'clock, new time, yes, I remembered, Roger, it's the 80-metre CW net on 3.543 megahertz. And then next Wednesday, March the 1st, as I mentioned, we've got a meeting at CNS between 7 and 9:30, remember longer hours now, and at the RSGB are coming to give a presentation on brickworks. And that's all open to everybody to come, whether you're in the training team, whether you just want to help, whether you're someone who wants to know, what do I do next? I've got my foundation or my intermediate and I want to know what to do next. So please come along to that meeting. Everybody is welcome from different clubs as well. And then just to tell us, remind you to send us your stories and your pictures that makes up this first part of the show. We love to hear from them. Send them to this address, radio@dcpmicro.com. And of course, not forgetting this card, which we're very happy to send to anybody who you think will be cheered, whether they're celebrating, whether they're not feeling too good. We will be very happy to add your name to ours and send them this card to anyone, anywhere in the world. They don't have to be radio amateurs, they don't have to be members of the club. Thank you. Now we're on to tonight's main event. And tonight's guest was only with us about a month ago, I think. He's from the USA. It's Frank, K4FMH. So let's welcome him. Good evening, Frank, or good evening for us.
Good evening and good afternoon from this side of the pond. Delighted to be with you once again, David and Tammy.
Yeah, remind us of where you are, Frank.
I am in Mississippi, a town called Ridgeland. It's just a northern suburb of the capital city of Jackson, and I live on a body of water called the Barnett Reservoir. And when I was with you before, I had a screenshot, and you noted there was a duck flying out of my head.
Yeah.
Actually, a Canadian geese, but hey, we call them ducks here as well.
Yep, well, that's good. And I guess that's your living room there. Well, anyway, we're going to hand over to you for giving us you're going to give us a talk on all about the transmit quality of modern transceivers. That's fascinating. And just to remind you at home now, if you have any questions or comments for Frank during his talk, please put them onto BATC or Facebook at any time. And then we'll, of course, read those to Frank at the end. But now over to you, Frank, and we'll have a chat at the end and any questions.
Thank you, and I'm sure you've shared my slides. There we go. And I've titled this talk, the subtitle, Speculative Reasoning Using Publicly Available Bench Tests. So this is far from a definitive study, but it is one of the few studies that we have on measures of transmit quality among modern transceivers. Let's see, make sure that... If you're familiar with Rob Sherwood, NC0B here in Colorado, I'm sure that you are. His very famous bench test of the receive quality of transceivers is sort of legion. He also made the argument that it's time to bring transmit quality back to the bench. And in the 2019 volume of QST, the ARL magazine, in the November issue, he published a paper, It's Time to Clean Up Our Transmitters. Now, that set a mental benchmark for amateur radio operators and manufacturers. It was not the first one, and I'll cover the previous ones, but he tested a few modern transmitters for their performance. And lo and behold, he found that the current group of transmitters don't even match the venerable Collins 32S3 of yesteryear. And Rob outlined 3 key elements of transmitter output that can be a problem. One is broadband transmitter noise, sometimes called phase noise, but it's phase noise as part of composite AM noise. And he argues that it's AM noise that dominates that in modern transceivers. Another one, if you're a contester, particularly, and you're a CW operator, you know the issue of key clicks from CW characters and how they spill over. And the third one, if you're a voice operator, is sideband splatter. I'm sure whether you've been in a contest or even in a good rag chew or what have you, you've had someone who was just splattering up and down the band because of problems with their transmitter. Now, I'll only deal in this talk with the first one, broadband transmitter noise. Briefly, what is that? Well, it's not often noticed, as Rob said, until you have a situation where 2 stations are physically close. And at the same time, it wasn't an issue in the days when we had crystal control transmitters. When synthesis occurred, they were not as good as they later became. So phase noise began to become present, and it was significant on both transmit and receive. But over the successive decades, phase noise more or less diminished, and most of the modern transceivers have a few problems with that. But the other type is amplitude noise, or AM noise, and it's received almost no discussion in formal transmitter evaluations and reviews. If you're in a strong signal environment, it doesn't matter whether it's phase or AM, it's the total noise that's most important. And he defines total noise as the composite noise, which is what our radios hear on the air, and it may degrade reception. Now, composite noise can be a real problem at field day and in contest stations. So
seem to have a problem with you, Frank, at the moment. Don't know whether your internet. Oh, well, you're back now, I think.
Okay.
Okay, you'll need to share your slides again, though, for us, Frank. Sorry, I think probably it was your internet connection that disappeared from what I could see.
Okay.
Just momentarily.
I'm on fiber, but nevertheless, we do have construction work and things like that where things can get erupted. You got me now again?
We have got you now, and we can now share your screen. So there we are.
Good. Okay, so I was saying that the total noise is what's really important. It's defined often as composite noise, which is phase noise and other noise, and it can be a real problem at field day or in contest stations or portable operations where you've got multiple transmitters and so on. Let me show you an illustration. This is a graphic from Rob Sherwood's 2019 QST paper, and he illustrates composite noise. Now, this was produced by Conrad Farlow, PA5Y, and Rob kindly shared an original with me. The one in QST, as is all too frequently the case, was really very grainy. So when you look at some measurements here of noise, the green line, I'll follow it with my cursor, is the composite noise. And you can see that the AM noise it pretty much parallels it, whereas the blue noise is phase noise. So the composite noise is dominated by AM rather than phase noise. And as you see the roll off at wider frequencies, you can kind of get an illustration of how important total noise rather than phase noise is for transmissions. Now, if you talk to manufacturers, they want to emphasize how low the phase noise is. And it's probably very true, whatever official figures that they quote you, I'm sure they are very valid. But keep in mind, it's the total noise, or AM noise that produces the potential problems. So his article published in 2019 was not the first time this has been raised. Leif Asbrink back in 2005 may have been the first one, and I'll briefly talk about Leif's results and his argument in the next slide. The very well known on this side of the pond, Jim Brown, K9YC, who's in audio engineering, and some of his papers you may have seen how to deal with RFI, with chokes and things. Jim is quite an expert on noise. And he made the argument that transmitters have largely been ignored. The result is a mess on our bands, especially during contests. If a rig transmits phase noise 20 dB louder than competing radios, and here he takes the ARRL to task. The ARRL review should say that in plain English and should state that radios should not be used to drive a power amplifier. Now, he used what the ARRL considers proprietary data. They'll publish data from their reviews in the magazine, but they won't make those public to members even. And Jim was able to get that proprietary data. Now, one of his key findings was that he found, surprise, surprise, the more you tend to spend on a transceiver, the dirtier the transmitter was. And yet that tended to run in families. And what Jim meant by that was certain manufacturers tended to have noisier transmitters. Well, his conclusions were very critical of the results printed in QST as not being as clear as the raw data would allow them to be. Now, in fact, QST publishes graphic representations of transmitter noise. I'll show you an example in a following slide. And they don't really release the data and give specific numbers that allow you to compare one transceiver in this issue with that new big shiny one that comes out a few issues later. You can't really put those up side by side and make a good judgment. Now, he got the data from Bob Allison, who was the head of the test lab at the ARRL and handled many of the test reviews. Bob is now retired. And I must say, I interviewed him for the ICQ podcast a couple of years ago. And what an amazingly nice person. Bob's just an amazing person. And the ARRL is certainly missing him. Now, I would argue that the ARRL not releasing these key data to all members may be a real obstacle for why manufacturers haven't really made any improvements, as we'll show in some of the data that I'll present this evening. And so that may actually be a deterrent toward improvements. Now, here's an example. As Rob says, in QST reviews, they use the term composite noise as interchangeable with phase noise. But as I showed you in a previous graph, and it is Rob Sherwood argues, those are confusing terms, and they're often published with graphical data. Now, Jim Brown presents the graphs in red in his paper, and I would present a challenge to the viewers. The first one is the Elecraft KX3. The one in the middle is the very popular Kenwood TS590, and the one on the right is the ICOM 7600. This is what you get in QST. Just take a moment. Can you make accurate comparisons of these three radios in terms of noise? If you are, you've got better eyes than I do and some others. So this is the presentation mode, and this is what Jim is really critiquing the ARRL on. Now, Leif Asbrink, SM5BSZ, in 2013, he had a follow-up paper that's available on the internet. And he said, I find it highly inappropriate that the ARRL reviewer chose to characterize that level of performance like this. And he's talking about the Flex Radio Systems 1500 SDR. I happen to have one. It's a 5-watt SDR. You can find them on eBay and elsewhere for about $300 to $400 USD today, and they're marvelous little radios. However, Here's what Asbrink says. The composite noise output is shown in figure 3, and it's low. In my opinion, Leif Asbrink's opinion, and I am confident many others will agree, these noise sidebands are unacceptably high because they will cause significant levels of interference to other band users who may not even realize where it's coming from. It applies above all when a Flex 1500 is used to drive a transverter for VHF, UHF, or microwave bands. And his point is a very subtle one, but a very important one, especially if you buy a small radio like a Flex 1500 at 5 watts maximum to drive an amplifier. That's why I bought it. I bought it to drive an RM Italy 250 watt amplifier when I'm out in the field with my portable operations team. Well, I'm going to have to really think hard about whether I want to do that. I'm going to have to do some more tests on my bench to see how much that noise is propagated and amplified through the amplifier. But imagine if we're using that to drive a transverter to do earth moon earth bounce or to operate at 10 gigahertz or any of the microwave bands that we want to do some DX contest. We may not realize it. We're not hearing ourselves, but others are. So Asbrink conducted some independent testing as well to compare transmit noise at different frequency offsets. You think about the closer in you are to a transmitter with your receiver, the more likely you are to detect splatter. Well, that should roll off. And so the typical measurement pattern is to take different size bandwidths to measure the noise. He focused on the Flex 1500 in particular, and he showed that phase noise, one part of composite noise, is especially high in this radio. And it may not be one that you'd want to use. And if you didn't know about it, as I didn't know about it when I bought it about 9 months ago, you do it blindly, and you may be contributing to noise on the bands here. Well, here's an example I want just to show how receive quality and transmit quality can be very different in the same radio. Asbrink made a table here, and you can see each model, the Elecraft K3, widely viewed as one of the top contesting radios of the last decade, I'm told. Several ICOMs, the Kenwood 590, the KX3, the QRP radio, 9100, the 450D, and so on and so on. And you can see here is a measure of noise, and in terms of reciprocal mixing performance at 20 kilohertz offset. And look at the same figure for receive versus transmit. And he concludes, the difference column. And so the greater the difference, the more you see how out of kilter the performance of the receiver is and the transmitter. And so here in the last column is what he calls the main focus. The transmitter at wide is transmitter noise at wide frequency separations. Now, this difference is in dB, but dBc is the dB of the signal beneath the carrier. So wherever the carrier is, it's the metric of how far beneath the carrier. And you can see the best transmitters come first, the K3. You can see why contesters have liked the K3, because it has a great performance here. So he began to show that there are very big differences and very noticeable differences in some very well-known radios that if you didn't measure this, and they are not really talked about in the reviews very, very much or very decisively, is his point, then you would never know it unless you have a bench and you test them yourself. Now, his criticism is that the difference in this wide column from 128 down to 77 is more than 50 dB. And what he finds particularly contentious is that it goes without comment in some of the ARRL reviews. Now, note, I'm a life member of ARRL, and I'm a assistant director volunteer in the Delta division, one of our regions. So As Pogo would say, we've met the enemy and we are one. Well, I are one, but this is Leif Asbrink's argument about we really need to focus on transmit, and we really haven't covered them in our reviews. So here's kind of the comeuppance of that. We've made some improvements, as Rob Sherwood in particular has documented, but has there been any progress in transmit purity? Now, I had the good fortune to publish a couple of papers in the ARRL's National Contesting Journal in 2021. I'll show you a graph in the next slide. And it documents the serious improvement that we have had by manufacturers in transceiver receive capability over the past 50 years of the radios in Rob Sherwood's list of tables. But what's been the manufacturer's response in the 18 years since Leif Asbrink's 2005 paper, in the 8 years since Jim Brown's study of transmit quality, really raking them over the coals, and since Rob Sherwood published a paper in QST itself calling the attention that no one has even matched the venerable Collins transmitter of yesteryear. There's been no appreciable change in the format of ARRL test data published in QST or a change in the proprietary status of their testing data. But independent amateur radio operators who have bench tests and have the engineering capability have made some progress in conducting independent transmit noise tests. And I'm using those data here in my talk tonight. Here is a graph from one of my papers in the National Contesting Journal. If you take Rob Sherwood's 9 bench tests, now he looks at one because he's a CW contester, and that's narrow dynamic range. But if you take all 9 of them and combine them into an index, look at this little chart where the median score over 50 years is this little red line. And look at what began to happen after 2000. It began to go up. And then about 2005, it went up again. And particularly around 2014. And this is a median and average at the same time of 100 with a standard deviation, which is how we measure variation, of 15. So there's 15, okay? And then there is 30. That's 2 standard deviations above the all-time average, and it's even higher than that. So now, particularly in the late 2000s, we have higher receive performance than as measured on a bench with quality gear than we ever have. So we've made performance in receive. A team of European amateurs, Team Charlie, TK0C, and Rob Sherwood have tested a number of modern transmitters for transmit purity. Now, Rick Westerman, DJ0IP, on his website at dj0ip.com, have curated those data and published them and made them available to the public. Now, I've used those data. I copied them, put them in a spreadsheet, and I communicate frequently with Rob Sherwood, and I got additional measurements on transmit purity from Rob, and I built a unique data set on 21 modern transceivers. Now, Rob has over 125 radios in his receive Sherwood table, so that's why I call this speculative reasoning. We only have 21, but they include a lot of very popular radios that are currently on the market and currently in use, including the Elecraft K4D, which has become a very, very popular radio, the Elecraft FTDX10, and the FT710 radio. So I took the transmit composite noise measurements for each radio. I included the Sherwood receive test. And then what do these things cost when they entered the market? And what year did they enter the market? And what was their average EHAM score as a measure of how satisfied are hams with each of these radios? So I put these together in a unique data set. I have published on my Fox Mike Hotel website, and I will mention that again before I finish. So they're available to everyone. To take transmit noise, but put it in the context of how well it receives, how do other people like it, what does it cost, and how long it's been on the market. Without going too deep in the weeds, let me just talk about measuring composite noise. These were measured at different power levels, but I took the measurement for 50 watts here. They seem to be the most reasonable, and Rob Sherwood concurred. And the three frequency offsets, 10 kilohertz, 20 kilohertz, and 100 kilohertz in dBs below the carrier per hertz, DBC, is the measurement to look at the power of a sideband and a modulated signal relative to the carrier. Minus 30 dBc is 30 dB below the carrier. It's got 1,000 times lower power. And so that's the metric. Here at the bottom, and David, I'll be happy to share my slides with you if any of your listeners would like to see them, so they're not hurting their eyeballs, if you will, to try to write down some of these little obscure websites. So,
okay, thanks. So if anybody would like these, then if you send me your slide set, then anybody like them, if you drop us an email, then we'll be happy to share it with you. Thank you, Frank.
Be happy to do that. But they're all available on the web there for all to see. So basically what I've done, and I'm told that by the new editor of Radcom that they're probably going to publish this. I think, they have a committee that reviews it, and I don't know if Ed's got all the reviews in, but it looks like they will. So I should hear pretty soon, and hopefully they will, and hopefully a version of this will be in Radcom at some point before too long. So there are really three elements here. So you have measurements of the transmit noise in a receiver. Okay, well, how does it receive? I mean, okay, it transmits either better or worse in terms of noise, but how well does it receive? What does this thing cost? Do other people like it? Is it a radio that has some big gotchas on it that maybe not is in the brochure? How do other people, other hams, what do they think of it? And how long has it been out? Usually if a radio has been out for a little while, there's some firmware updates or there are improvements. And so things get better if they have little flaws in it. And the real question is, are the lowest noise transceivers also better receivers? And so are we making progress over time? So there's three parts here, and I won't belabor it too much. One is the description and visualization with graphs of which transceivers have lower noise than others. And second is to compare the transmit quality to Sherwood's receive performance and price and year market entry and the EHAM ratings. And third is a little experimental thing. If you go into a amateur radio store that's a nice one and they have a lot of different brand radios and you get to sort of kick the tires on them, as we say here in the States, if you're buying a car, you like to kick the tires. Are some of them similar? So I used a statistical procedure to compare them on these things, and which are somewhat similar and which are somewhat dissimilar, and why. So I'll end it with that. So I want to wave my arms and tell you, please don't use any results like this. And I talked for about an hour with Rob Sherwood yesterday about some of his work and my work. And he tries to tell people, don't use my ranking just to pick the top one and here's my money and I'll go buy it. Think about how you're going to use your radio, which features for each radio that maybe you're close in thinking about purchasing, which do you really want? Some people don't like the SDRs because they say they like knobs. Some love the computer interface. Well, which one are you? Where do you fit into that? And also ergonomics. Will you be moving the radio? Is it really heavy or is it light? Where are you going to put it? And those things. So please put those things into your shopping list instead of just using numbers like this. But what this research and what Rob's research does as well is looking at transceivers that are similar in terms of their performance and then look at what they cost, and if you want to spend more money on that radio, know what you're paying that extra money for, because it may be well worth it. It may be well worth it. So that's the prelude, and we'll get started. I'll say that there's a strength and weakness to this. The strength is that the internal validity of the study, each transistor, transceiver was tested the same. The public was told how they were tested, and they're comparable to common test standards. The weakness is how can we generalize to other radios not included in this, and we really can't from a scientific standpoint. So hopefully we'll get more transmit tests, and this can be expanded. So I call this speculative reasoning using data, but it is a contribution relative to Rob Sherwood's 2019 paper, because no one's done this before. So let's look at the phase noise and see what we're talking about. We'll look at a table of the actual measurements. We'll look at how the roll-off, each bandwidth varies by radio, and that should be 21 rather than 22 modern transceivers vary, and how they're ranked and the metric. Okay, here's a table of statistical gobbledygook, right? Well, let's look at it, for example. Here's the measure of the popular Anon Apache 7000. And at 10 kilohertz, it's minus 145. At 20, minus 147, goes up a little bit. And then at 100 hertz, it's down further. Well, that makes sense, right? Because the further away you go from a carrier, the less you're going to have noise. Well, you can do this for all of them, and you can look at these little trends. And I've got this in a nice little graph here in a minute. But this shows you just the average. You take the three, divide them up, divide by 3. Here's your average. But as Rob Sherwood says, it's important to look at the variability. And I've computed the standard deviation among these three. And you can see that the Elecraft K3S, I have friends who swear by this radio. They're CW contesters. It's that old thing about you'll pry my K3S out of my cold dead finger with my cold dead fingers. I'll take it to my grave. Well, it's extremely consistent in its transmit noise. Okay, it's extremely consistent. Well, look at the K4D that they've just released. It's up, 5.89. The Flex 6600, both of those, I have a Flex 6400 along with this 1500, and it has a great deal of variability. My ICOM 705 is here. So you can see that these transceivers vary in how they're dealing with transmit noise. Now, I used a technique I had used for Sherwood's composite of 9 bench tests. And without going too much into details, I put them together in a linear composite and transformed them using what's called a T-score. A T-score has an average of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. So the Apache Anon, it has lower noise than the average at 72, the K3 at 85, and you go on here to the Flex 1500 that I bought, and Asbrink just kind of really ranted and raved about how much noise it has. Well, you can see its composite index is a standard deviation and a half above the average. So these are the data that we're talking about. The second highest radio here between the Yaesu FTDX 3000 and the Apache, is almost 2 standard deviations. So there are clear imbalances among radios. Okay, so we have the measurement index, and I've used what I call a ranked dot plot. And I encourage you to think about this anytime you see ranking. If you had your favorite football team and they were in a tournament and they placed 5th, would they come back cheering to the pub, hey, we're number 5, we're number 5? Probably not. But what if the actual performance of your favorite football club, if you measured it in some numerical fashion, what if being number 5 was just within an order of a decimal point to being number 1? Well, that's the problem when you have ranked data, is you don't know the actual underlying metric. So here is a display of them. You can see the Apache has the lowest, followed by the Flex 6700. Oh, and look who's ranked third, the Elecraft K4D. But look at that gap. It's about a 74 up to about an 81. Gosh, that's almost a standard deviation gap, yet it's only one rank different. So each of the Elecrafts kind of following line. Their newer radios have less noise than their older radios. Then there's another jump to the Yaesu FTDX 10110. This was the first radio that Rob Sherwood tested that had 100 dB narrow dynamic range. It was a little over 100 dB, and that made quite a bit of noise. So then the ICOM flagship 7851, even though it's one rank different, look at the gap. That gap is about 93 to 97. Well, that's about a third of a standard deviation. Here is the median score, and you can see that while Yaesu's most recent radios, the FTDX 10 and its little brother, the FT710, even though the 710 is one rank lower, there is no numerical difference, absolutely none. But unless you had the metric underlying it, you would never know that. And so you can see this particular pattern in the particular noise as it arrays itself. You can see that each one of these offsets correlate with each other quite a bit, and then how they correlate with the index. This is a little fancy graph that measures the variation at each of the offsets at 10 kilohertz, 20 kilohertz, and 100. And as you would expect, it tends to get lower the further away from the carrier that you go. Now, what we don't know is how each individual radio behaves. Does each individual radio just monotonically go down? Well, David, you talked about that surplus radio gear having explosives. I hope that your head doesn't explode on this one. Rob Sherwood said he had a hard time figuring this one out. Note in bold, the chart reads from left to right. The manufacturer, a non-Elecraft, and so on. The radio here. And then you've got each of the specific measurements and the index. So what I did was I took the main radio from each manufacturer. Now, Anon only has one. And so I put it in heavy blue lines. So the Apache 7000, boom, at 10 kilohertz, it's got the absolute lowest. Well, look, it's not the absolute lowest at 20, which is the absolute lowest. It's the Flex 6700. So it outdoes the Anon there. Not much, but slightly, and you can see that. And then the Anon captures, or it's at the base here again, with the Yaesu FTDX 101. So notice that the Yaesu, for instance, it doesn't do as well close in, but it does extremely well as you get to 100 kilohertz. And if you look at the ICOM 7851, it's sort of in the middle of the pack close in. It's sort of in the middle of the pack at 20 kilohertz, and it sort of stays at the middle of the pack here at 100 kilohertz, and then on the index itself. So I wanted to just share that with you, that these radios, because of their internal engineering design, many times we don't really have the schematic unless we buy the service diagram, and we have to know enough about the engineering on top of that. So I wanted to just illustrate how these flagships will vary internally. I did forget the Kenwood. Now, you take the Kenwood TS890, it runs up at 10 kilohertz. It's one of the poorer ones. It's not much better than my Flex 1500 here. it does get better over the bandwidth. But surprisingly, the TS890 has a little higher noise level than the price that you pay for it might suggest. Therein, we need research like I'm doing to figure out what are you getting for what you're paying for. So I hope that was not a bomb that was in an old piece of war surplus radio here. It might be to some of the manufacturers, but we'll let them.
I'm sorry, Frank. Just before you go, can we go back to that slide, so that I can be clear, and maybe others as well? In an ideal world, then, you're looking for the flattest line, aren't you? Surely, as an overall performance, or not?
Well, let's think about that. Great question. Great question. Each radio has an engineering team, right? And they have a theory of how they want to design them. Well, Flex has a fully SDR design. ICOM might have a superhet or a combination, like Yaesu has got a combination. One of the things about their FTDX, their 101 and their 10 and then their 710 is they've got an SDR followed by a superhet, right? So these different manufacturers have a different theory, and I'm putting air quotes around the term theory. They have a design perspective, and it's important for us to realize that they come at the different problems of a receiver or a transmitter with a different approach to try to solve the problem. Now, let's come to your question, which is a great one. In a great world, you would have low noise on all of these, but then we'd all be paying much more money, right? So if you think about the design, I don't think that Yaesu created the much less expensive FT710 radio to be a contester's delight, because their 101, which is much more expensive, and it performs better on these filters, and filtering can be one of the cost components that goes into how these things price out. So yes, in an ideal world, all these would be low on all three. But in reality, they are designed because of the manufacturer's theory or their approach. This one would be an entry-level radio. It will price out at a certain level. Our flagship radio will cost, I don't know, maybe say 5 times more. And it will have a lot more of the bells and whistles that make it a better radio, part of which is having low transmit noise. When we get to the charts where you compare these on noise and what they cost, at least when they entered the market, you'll see some of these design choices that originate in this very graph and how they play out in the pricing. So I've tried not to dance around what you're asking me, but in an ideal world, they would all be down here in very, very low noise. But then some of them would cost a lot more
So it's a compromise, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah. And it's on purpose, because would you want everybody to emulate Hilberling and have just terribly expensive radios?
No.
Well, probably not. And I was a little personally disappointed. I'll just share a purchase decision. I bought the little Flex 1500. The bloke that does the Gas Labs, I love his videos on YouTube. I forget his name and his call sign. I think he works for one of the vendors in the UK. He was talking about the 1500. It was one of the best bargains on the used market. And I knew about the 1500. I used to have a 3000 before I bought the 6400. And I thought, wow, there's one on eBay for $305. I'll buy that. Great. Little did I know that if I want to use it with an amplifier, I'm going to have to look pretty hard at what kind of noise it's coming out of the amplifier if I drive it with the much cheaper 1500. So there's just a personal example. And I don't think I got a bad radio. It's just, how do you use it if it has higher noise than you really want? Well, you may not want to use it with an amplifier. Well, I happen to have an ICOM 705 that doesn't have as much noise. Well, it's a QRP radio, right? well, I can use that to drive that amplifier. So it's about understanding, David, from my perspective, understanding data like these, having them explained in a way that kind of makes sense to the average ham, whatever that means, and then use that as you go shopping to make wiser decisions that fit how you want to use it. When I did that with the 1500, it will just make me use it differently. But it's a great little QRP radio. And so I'm not disappointed with my purchase, and I don't feel like I was fooled. I think the guy who did the thing at the Gas Lab was spot on. It's a great, high-quality SDR radio that is a lot cheaper than some others, but probably you don't want to hook it up to an amplifier or use it in front of a transverter. Does that help at all?
Oh, yes, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted just a rough idea, but yeah, they should all be as low as possible, and ideally, I suppose, flat all the way across.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And yes, you too can buy one that's flat. Get your checkbook out.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's the reality, right? But the same thing with automobiles. I mean, you know, that's the way most consumer products cost. So in short, there are some distinctive differences among manufacturers' flagship transceivers in transmit composite noise. The little Flex 1500 that I just used as an example, and is one that Leif Asbrink used as an example. He was upset because the QST review of the 1500 didn't mention that high noise. Well, I also have a 6400, one of their flagship radios, the lower end of their flagship radios, but they have far less noise. So as you begin to look across these 21 modern transceivers, there are some distinctive differences, and some rank no better than the same manufacturer's own mid-level radios. So we'll show some of that here in a moment. Now, as Sherwood complained about in his paper in QST, some manufacturers have focused on receive capability to the detriment of transmitter development. Asbrink, he has some comparisons and shows this rather clearly, and that it does vary by manufacturer. Now, Jim Brown really went for the jugular, as they say, and claiming they're just bad manufacturers using data from the ARL. And he says some, and he pointed out Yaesu, that they just have noisy radios. Now, we're going to look at this in more detail, and his data were among some older radios, and we're going to see how Yaesu has changed since then. So these results, even though they're only 21, I think they place a finer point on the argument than has been previously available, okay? So in part two, here's the main question. Are lower transmit radios better receivers? And I'm talking about better on the bench, not as you twiddle the dial and how you feel about it, although we'll compare EHAM to look at an aggregate number. And at what price? So what's the relationship between noise on transmit and receive? Is Brown right about some transceivers being dirty, particularly with some manufacturers? And what are the optimal transceivers on both low transmit noise and receive? We'd want that, right? We all want ice cream with sprinkles on top, if we can get it. And if we can, at what price does better performance occur in both transmit and receive? All right, now here is a scatter plot that gets to the heart of the matter in some ways. Here is the composite noise here on the y-axis and receive noise on the x-axis. I put blue lines at the median for each one. So you've got a 4-panel quad. And in manufacturing or the business world, that's called the magic quadrant. You want to minimize bad stuff, maximize good stuff. Well, what's the good stuff? Well, we want to be above average in receive performance. Well, and we want to be below average in noise. So this lower right-hand quad is, I call it the golden quad. I don't use the word magic, but the golden quad. And I've got color used here to identify the different radios. Now, overall, the R-squared statistics about 15%. So there's a little bit of a relationship. It's just not a huge one. between receive performance and transmit noise. Here's a big point. There's not one radio that gets the lowest noise and the highest receive. Ideally, David, we would want a dot right here. That would be on these two variables, that would be the top optimal radio right here. Well, we don't have one. Well, the one that is the top on composite receive on all 9 of Rob Sherwood's tests is this one. Oh, gee, it's above average in noise, just like its brother, my 6400. The 710, we use this example, the 710 and the FTDX10, it's right at the median on transmit noise. But look at the 101. It's got lower transmit noise, and it's one of the better receivers. So we begin to look at one that, while it's not where we'd like to have it, which is down here, it's better. It's one of the better receivers. You would take this little group right here and say they're pretty high on the receive capability and they're lower noise. Well, what's got the lowest noise? The Apache. But it's not as good a receiver as the 6700, and it's not as good as the K4D. Look at how Elecraft has continued to get better in receive and lower in noise. It's the thing we're going to see throughout my talk. Only Elecraft and Yaesu made incremental improvements. Now, this comes back to Jim Brown's argument. Notice the earlier Yaesu radios, the 1000 MP and the 2000. They all had higher than average noise. But look what happened in their next generation. Oops, it dropped. So when Jim Brown was looking at this, he was looking at this era of radios. So Yaesu has made an improvement, clearly, on their HF radios, and so has Elecraft. But there's not one that captures the ideal, which would be right here. All right, so let's look at what it costs. So if you want to get the best transmit noise radio, what would you have to pay? Well, the very best one is the Apache, and it's about $4,000. I
think.
Okay, all right. As we say here in the States with cell phone companies, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
I can hear you now. Okay, so if you want the lowest noise, you would buy the Apache, because it costs about $4,000. The next one would be the Flex 6700, their flagship. About 8,000 roughly. Then you would get into the 3 Elecraft radios. Then you would get into the FTDX 101D, which is the flagship Yaesu, and so on and so on. So what would be the optimal? Well, you want to pay nothing. You want them to give you one, right? I mean, we'd all like that. And you'd want it to be the lowest noise. So the ideal one would be they're giving them away for a quid here, right in the corner. Well, we don't have any there. Well, what's the closest? Well, if you really want to maintain this little quadrant here, there are only 2 that fall into that quadrant, and they both happen to be Elecraft, the K3 and K3S. Well, most of us aren't quite that rigid, are we? We get in the store, we look at them, we've got these numbers in our mind, but we look and we go, well, boy, that K4D, it costs a lot more, but it's got some things I like and that sort of thing. What's the 800-pound gorilla in this graph? Look at the 7851. It's just below the median on noise. But wow, it's what? 3 times more expensive than the lowest noise radio? Now, again, let me beseech you to don't just use this graph to make a decision. But there's a lot of things that this radio brings to the market that isn't captured in this graph. But if you were going to look at transmit noise alone, it would be a fairly expensive radio for the same noise level of, say, its predecessor, the 7610. It's about the same. I mean, it's only just 2 or 3 points. The 101D, which is a little better in terms of the absolute number at about 88, it would be a third if they gave you a cover and all the cabling and stuff with it. So clearly, you can pay a lot. Know what you're paying for. That's the punchline. Know what you're paying for, and we'll continue with this. What if you want them both together? What if I want the best receive and the best transmit? Well, I computed a ratio. On the Sherwood Performance Index, you want a higher number. And on transmit noise, it's a bad thing. You want a lower number. So if you take a ratio of the Sherwood Performance Index to the composite noise, then the higher that ratio, the better they are simultaneously. And the Flex 6700 was a little better receiver than the Apache 7000. So you can see where its ratio came out first. Second's the Apache, and there's a little bit of a gap here. And you move on down to the 101D and the K3S. And when you talk to other hams who have these, and each one says, this one I have, it's the absolute best. My friend Scott Wright, K0MD, who was editor of the National Contesting Journal, he's a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. He's a contester. He has a K4D. He sold his ICOM 7851, and he raves to me about this K4D. He said he loves that. Well, you can take any of these radios, particularly for contesters, and they will rave, and you can see why. They get receive and transmit very well. They get it right in a sense, but each one has things about it that those individual hams like, and so don't forget that. And so again, you've got these. So here's the 7851 here. It's kind of fallen away from the pack. And again, if you rank ordered these, you would get a certain sense. But look at these gaps. The 590 SG is much better than the 7600 on this ratio. So that's the problem with ranks, is you have to really begin almost to plot out what the ranks are based upon. So you can see when you put them both together, which ones seem to do better. Okay. Now, what does that optimization cost you? And so here is that ratio. Okay. And you see the Flex had the highest ratio. Well, look at what you'd be paying for. So we said before that if you want lower noise, what would you buy? And we looked at it. Well, if you want to get, at least with regard to Sherwood's measurements, put together all 9 of them, and the transmit composite noise at those 3 offsets, then putting them together, the Flex would be about 8,000. The Anon, the Apache Anon, would be about 4. So you couldn't buy 2 of the Anons for one Flex, but almost. And so when you put them together, you begin to see, ideally, we would want this quad. We would want that highest ratio. They're just way up here, and you pay almost nothing for them. A square root of nothing, as my friend Martin Butler, M1MRB, would say. So what do we see again? Well, we see kind of a lonely data point out here with the 7851. So the question is, if it's not receive and noise, what are you paying for? Well, in the Flex, you're buying these multiple SCU units. So you can have multiple receivers, and you can actually have them operating on multiple bands at the same time. You can have FT8 on 2 different bands, for example. Well, you are paying for some other things in these flagship radios. So don't forget that. Don't forget that. And there's a lot of other things that are in these radios. But it's up to you before you put down your money to try to figure out what's best for you. And that's what I hope that, I'm trying to do. The ones that seem to fit the best for the least are these radios that are offered by Elecraft, Flex, Kenwood, and Yaesu, more or less, as configured here, that fit the profile. Okay. So let's look at this. Now, Frank, you might say, gosh, how much noise does it take for us to really hear it? That's a good question. Rob Sherwood is often asked, well, how much of a dB difference in narrow dynamic range does it take for you to hear it? Well, if you're a contester in CW, you might have a radar detector that's pretty sensitive because you're trying to hear this weak CW signal and you're trying to interpret it. Sideband might be a little easier because you can get the inflection of the voice. Well, does it make a difference in consumer satisfaction if you got a noisier radio? How do hams rate these transceivers on EHAM? In other words, does lower transmit noise, do they get higher ratings? And does it matter enough to be noticed among the other attributes? So here is the composite transmit noise. Low is better. Our EHAM rating, high is better. Obviously, we would want to be right down here to be perfect. And the thing you have to keep in mind, if anything, there is a positive halo effect in the EHAM data. The median score is 4.7 out of 5. 4.7 out of 5. And so here again, you've got these little quadrants. And what do we find? Well, we find the highest rated, lowest noise seems to be the Apache. The K4D has got almost as low a noise, and it's got all fives. So now the Flex 6700, it's average on its rating, but it's the second lowest. So what I recommend to hams when I've given talks to, I guess, maybe about 15 groups now, look at the number that's here. This is the overall number among some range of hams that have these radios or have used them. Go read what they say. Some of them are just bollocks. I remember one that didn't like the packaging and didn't wear. Geez, how long are you going to have the packaging? Like about 15 minutes or something? You may store the box in your, in your attic or somewhere in case you have to send it back. But you'll have some of those reviews that just don't make much sense to you. Look at what they're saying if they're negative. Look at what they're saying if they're positive. Hopefully this will help you narrow down, and then you can investigate, say, on EHAM, those that criticize him, why. There's an 800-pound gorilla on this chart, and it's the FPDX 101. The metrics were very good on receive and low noise, but it gets an abnormally low rating. And I went and read it, and here's what it appears to be. If you just listen to those on EHAM, if you go down to the pub and you got a pint and you just listen to the conversation, and there's, politics or, something else going on, you can just listen and hear the tenor of what people are saying. Or if you'll do that with the EHAM and reading the reviews, what are they saying about it? What I read when I read the reviews of the 101D, those that really trash it complained about the documentation was hard to read. And that the default settings, of which there are many, Yaesu is renowned for having lots and lots and lots of menus and submenus. It's like a tree out in your yard that's branched all over. Some people don't like that. And I think from when I read the negative reviews, it's complicated radio. It gives you lots and lots of power. And some people didn't like that. So, you have to take that into account there. So it doesn't look like there's much of a relationship overall of transmit noise to consumer satisfaction. But on the other hand, every one of the radios that had low noise had average or better EHAM ratings, with the exception of the 101D. So There may be a little bit of a relationship, but it's nuanced. So your mileage may vary, and I would read the reviews. Well, okay, so some of the flagship radios differ. We've shown that. There's somewhat of a relationship between receive performance and transmit noise. They vary in prices. Some are much more expensive, some are less. Some of the mid-range radios are as good as the flagship. But has there been any improvement? And in these data, the time horizon, if you look at the year each one was released to the marketplace, is about 25 years. So that's about half as long as all the radios in Rob Sherwood's list, which is a half century, is 50 years. So the question is, has transmit noise gotten lower over time, and have specific manufacturers made progress in their transmitters? And we'll look at that now. In general, there's almost no relationship between what year it entered the marketplace and the transmit noise. You can see the more recent radios, they vary quite a bit. The earlier radios, they vary quite a bit. And so there's really not really any overall relationship. However, you can see flex ever so much, just incrementally going from 85 to 83 to almost 80 successively in their flagship radios. Well, they only make one. So I guess there's something to be said for focus on improving a particular design. And they seem to have done that. Flex made a jump from the 1500 to their flagship. Nothing, it's a little bit dramatic here in the improvement to the 6700, but yet they're 64 and 66. And it's better, but not great. So a little bit of work there. Yaesu did some with these earlier two radios and then these, but in general, there's not been a systematic response on improvement in lowering transmit noise by any manufacturer, with the exception of Elecraft, a little bit by Yaesu and Flex. Okay, so what do you do? How do you approach this to go get the best radio for you? I don't have a complete answer, but I will give you some advice. One of the things that we do in statistics is find groups in data, and can range everywhere from cancerous tumors. I had cancer in 2005. When they measure these tumors, they take a lot of data points and they compare it to the rest of your body, and they want to be able to identify a tumor from some of these scans. And you do it in everything else, in automobiles and elsewhere. So this is well established. You've got some metrics you want to compare a product on. Okay, put your feet to the fire and name what you think is important. Okay, well, transmit noise, receive performance, price, and EHAM satisfaction. We want low noise, we want high receive performance, we want a low price, and we want a high satisfaction score, because that means other people have looked at it and they like it and they hadn't found any big problems with it. So use the method. It's very common. It's how they compare Homo sapiens to other species in anthropology and archaeology, and in a lot of different sciences. They use cluster analysis. I did this, and then I did it several different ways to see would it break apart and would I continue to get the same groups. And the 5 groups that I landed on, I think, are pretty stable as far as this kind of work goes. Now, okay, so why do this other than academic exercise? Well, it may help ham radio operators who are in the market for a transceiver to see groups of radios as being similar. So when they think about how they're going to use it, I'm a rag chewer, I just want good audio, I want ease of use. I'm not a contester. I'm not an experimentalist. I'm not going to be tearing it apart, making changes on it. Or I am a contester and I'm a CW op, or I'm a DXer or whatever. When you find out where you want to be and you approach these 5 groups, then that will help you zero in on some radios to begin your analysis. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read this. I just wanted to illustrate what the results are going to look like. We'll have our scatter plot once again of transmit, noise, and receive, but I'll color code the different groups of radios here so you can see why they fall out the way they do. And it'll have a comparison of each one of those four variables: receive performance, transmit noise, price, and consumer satisfaction, and then what group that they're in. So let's look at that very quickly. So in group number one, you might think the odd couple, wow, the FT710 and the 890S. One of the reasons these came together, they have some of the best receive numbers of any of them. The blue is the Sherwood Index 135. This one here, 134. This one, 133. All three of these are the very best receive performance. But they are only about average on noise. And this is where the 890S kind of fell a little bit. You expected it to be much better than this less expensive F10, but they have higher phase noise than maybe you would expect. And it kind of hurt them in a sense. And two, their price was cheaper. It was below the median. So you want a great receiver and you want to pay a little less, particularly on this 710, you might begin with group one. All right, group two, it had just as good, within 2 points of receive score. It was very average, right on the median score on noise. But it had a lower satisfaction score. And so you can see, primarily this is what pulled the whole group down, but these have a pattern of having a lower score. I've talked with Gerald Youngblood of Flex Radio Systems. He is actually from this part of Mississippi originally before he moved to Texas. And he comes back here sometimes for a holiday, and I've talked to him. And one of the problems that some hams have is they'll buy a Flex radio for the power and those brick wall filters and all that. But then they say, I want a radio with a knob and I don't like it. And they review it on eHam accordingly. Well, people will think whatever they choose to think. It's their views and their money and their radio. So this group has a lower eHam rating, but great receivers, average noise. All right, group three. It doesn't have as good a receive capability. Got a little better, a little lower noise, a little better on noise, but just above average on receive. It's got kind of an average rating. It's right there in the middle of the pack, and it's a little cheaper than some others. So if you want kind of a middle of the road radio, maybe it's got some features that you like, those in group three might be something you'd look at. I have a 7300 and a 705 and a 590 SG out of that group, along with my nefarious 1500. I need to quit picking on the 1500. It's a great little box, and I look forward to using it some more. All right, group four. It's just in the second tier on receive capability. Not bad at all, but wow. It's got the best noise. It's got the best noise in terms of low noise. Why? Apache Flex 6700 in all three of the Elecraft. It's the one that if noise is important to you and you can take a little bit off the numbers on receive, then wow, you might look at it. It's got a better rating on eHam, so other people like it. And it's about average. So these are not terribly expensive radios. They receive well. They got the best noise. So if you want something that's performing the best on the bench, group four might be what you'd want to look at. Well, there's only one radio in group five, and you might think, okay, it's got just as good a receive as groups one and two. It's got lower than average noise at 97. People like it. It's above average. It's a standard deviation above average on eHam, but you're going to pay for it, and it's the ICOM 7851. So its pricing point pulled it out over and over and over again in the different analyses I did, pulled it out of the pack relative to its receive performance its transmit noise, and how others like it. So this might be some groups that you might start with to see where your use case fits and what you might want to do. So if we look on the transmit noise here low, remember what we want here is best and lowest. So we want in this quadrant. You can see how the different groups here. Number 4, these are the hot rods, as we would say here. These are the performers. This is a group. This is group number 2, both the 710 and 101D. It got hurt by the EHAM rating. That's why it got pulled out. 7851 in the group by itself, although it's very comparable on these two variables than the others. Price is what got it. So you can see how these radios were just not as good performance-wise. They fell into group 3. They're kind of the middle of the road. Now, they got some great features. I love the 705 and the 7300 interface. If you know one, you know the other one. So get outside of the bench and look at what you want and look at what you desire, and are you willing to pay for it? And I think that's the thing that would help. Apache Flex, Elecraft, and Yaesu seem to all be contenders for at least getting one's attention to buy a new radio. So let me conclude here. Again, speculative reasoning, but we don't have any other data, and it's not a definitive study, but I hope it's a template for future studies. It's a valid response to Sherwood's article. I asked him to look at my slides, and he said other than that parallel coordinate slide that he really couldn't follow, he thought it told a pretty good story. So I hope that these 21 transceivers are worth looking at. There's not a single radio that gets it all right, but there was no evidence that fit Jim Brown's argument that higher priced radios are dirtier in terms of transmit noise. I think that's due to the fact that he was using an older set, and some have gotten marginally better. So these results do facilitate amateurs using independent data to help them think through their radio purchase. I don't get anybody giving me money. Rob Sherwood will not take any money. So Leif Asbrink doesn't take any money. So the people who are independent, they don't publish a magazine with advertising. And I'm not saying that magazines change their reviews because they take advertising, but that manufacturers do call them into question if they don't get a great review. Notice the current issue of QST, for example. There's one of the most scathing reviews of the Jaegu XP125B amplifier. Jaegu doesn't advertise in QST. So you have to evaluate that for yourself as to whether Asbrink is saying something very valid, that they'll let some things go by and they don't point them out. You have to make your own judgment with that. But I hope this helps you think about, what am I paying for relative to the features on radios that have the same received bench test performance and lower transmit noise, and other people kind of like them and hadn't found any gotchas. I do hope that the ARL will publish all of their test data for transceivers, particularly those on transmit that go into those graphics. They shouldn't be considered proprietary data that is only in the league headquarters except in print. It should be a member benefit. And I think it would speak to transparency and independent analysis to always help the marketplace be more efficient. And if you think capitalism is a good way to do an economy, that helps the marketplace be more efficient, is open and transparent product reviews like this. So one of the things, and I'll end with this, that there's a need for human usability study on modern transceivers. I'm thinking about getting a Zoom group with some people who use some of these flagship radios and get them to talk about what are the features that they like about a particular radio or don't like. What is it that makes a difference? And in the software world, I've done some of this back in my career, software usability. seeks to how do we improve this version of Microsoft Word or Excel spreadsheet or anything else, and how do we make it better? We need to know the following. How fine of a composite noise in dB under carrier per hertz is discernible? How much noise does it take for you to hear it? The same thing could be said for receive performance. Rob can't tell you that. He can tell you what his opinion is. I can tell you what mine is. But we need to know how intersubjective that human experience is. One level of noise might be fine for one ham, and it might be terrible for another. And we simply do not know the answer to that. Now, secondly, there's no incentive for manufacturers themselves to do this. They spend money on advertising the positives of their product line, just as automakers do. But we must not, as consumers, in my opinion, be left to scan the pages of magazines and websites for advertisements to evaluate expensive purchases such as HF transceiver that can run up to $15,000 or more. Certainly, Hilberling's run that in the ICOM 7851. If you fully outboard it, it does as well. Now, independent researchers like Sherwood, Asbrink, and Brown, and some others, they don't have the money to do this. Nobody gives Sherwood radios. He goes and gets one that he picks out at a radio store, and the manufacturer doesn't give him a radio to test. Now, he only tested the Xiegu G90 radio because I bought one when MFJ was selling it, and I told him when I was talking with him on the phone that I've never opened my box, never even taken the tape off of it. So I shipped it to him without ever opening it, and that's the only way he would test it. He shipped it back to me, and I sold it to a friend, a member of my portable ops team, and I only touched that radio once, and it was after N5 Delta Uniform had it at one of our portable ops events. So individuals don't have the money to do this, but the ARL and perhaps the RSGB, by comparison, represents its members. Now, shouldn't each of those evolve their test laboratories to be what here in the States we call an underwriter's laboratory for amateur radio transceivers, to be independent? Now, that would force them to have a pact with their advertisers that the lab is going to be transparent, and they will call it as they see it where the technical merits are warranted. The Xiegu XPA 125 amp, the current QST, is one I mentioned. And they need to publish all of the test results in spreadsheets or other forms for members to use without restriction. And if manufacturers pull back in their advertising dollars, then that speaks to what the manufacturer's position is with regard to advertising. And that may be the price that the league has to pay for doing what's best for the membership. So let me thank you for listening. I have in the current issue of CQ Magazine an article that describes some of the pages at my website, Fox Mike Hotel, where I've got some interactive tools that primarily that article deals with the receive performance from Sherwood. But yesterday I added the graphs that I used in this talk today. So if you go to Fox Mike Hotel under the hamography studies, rigs and price satisfaction studies, you'll find these tools there today. I will tell you there are a couple of the older charts I need to update, the golden quads. I don't think they have the FT10 or the FTDX10. So I'll get that done over the next week or two. And I want to thank Scott Wright, K0MD. He pushed me in as a statistician to look at transmit purity after I'd published the receive performance work. And I want to say Rob Sherwood has been just an outstanding professional and an objective consultant for me in all of my work. I am not an engineer. He is. I'm a statistician and a ham. And I'm just grateful for the advice and wise counsel of both. But any errors here and any opinions are mine and certainly not theirs. So, David and Tammy, I'll turn it back to you. And you need to wake up all parties out there who are listening, because I probably put them to sleep tonight.
Well, no, not at all. I don't think you put them to sleep. I think they might have got their extra glasses or microscopes out a little bit on the screens. But as you've said, you're kindly going to let people have either the slideshow or, as you've said as well, your website has got that on. So just again, that was HTTP, I think, foxmikehotel, all one word, .com. Yeah?
Correct.
great. I think we do have a little bit of a what we call lip sync problem with your voice and your face, but it's okay because all the words are coming out and it's no problem. So then there's a bit of a delay there. Anyway, Mike,
I'm going to go back to the first slide. David, I'm going to go back to the first slide. So you've got my websites there, so anyone can see that. And then I'll go to any slide. If there's a question, I can go to any slide easily.
There we are. Yeah, so it's foxmikehotel.com. That's the main one. If you want to contact Frank. Yeah, well-earned drink, Frank. Thank you. So, as always at this time, I ask you if you haven't already done so. We've got one set of questions from Mike, G4GUG, and I'll read those to you in a moment. But if you haven't yet done it and you'd like to make a comment or an observation or a question for Frank, then please do that right now. I'm going to start off. I'm going to read Mike's questions in a moment. But one of the things that occurs to me, and I remember, by the way, we had Rob Sherwood on NARC Live and on the RSGB program that we produce as well. And I remember him saying on both of those that he was puzzled that nobody seemed to focus much on transmit quality. And it was all about the receiver, and it occurs to me that maybe the reason for that is that in our shack, the only thing we can hear or see is the receive. We can't really see what we're putting out unless you put an oscilloscope on it or something. You can't really see what's actually going out there. And it's obviously only going to be the people that are listening are going to hear us. So do you think that's one of the reasons that it hasn't had the focus that it maybe should have done, Frank?
Yes, I think there are two reasons, David, and that's a great observation. One of the things that has happened is now when we have the pan adapter based receivers, we not only hear a signal, whether it's CW or sideband, and gosh, I guess some people like to listen to FT8, but we hear them. But when we see them on the pan adapter and the waterfall, we can see those that are splattering. We can see those that are oddly shaped, for example, or somehow erratic. So I think some hams have the capability of seeing the problems. And with web-based SDRs, you can use a web-based SDR, and there are plenty around the world. There are some marvelous ones, like the one at Twent and elsewhere. So that's one thing. The second thing, and Asbrink said this, and I concur, because particularly the ARL has not published their transmit quality data in a way that we could compare radios, there's been no market pressure. But your point is the underlying one. Many hams are simply oblivious. They simply are unaware and have, with the traditional knob radio, they would have no reason to be aware that they have that much noise. You're spot on.
Okay. Well, thanks, Frank. So I'm going to come now with the questions. So far, I've only got a few points and questions from Mike G4GUG, but if you've got those questions or points at home, please enter them now. So firstly then from Mike, who says, what determines transmit IMD in SDR-based transmitters? Is it the quality of software or faster processing, he asks?
As I say, I'm not an engineer per se, but I hang around with some. And I think to some degree it's both. It depends on the design. If you've got a pure SDR, that front end is wide open. And so therefore the design and some of it's in the firmware of the radio and how it interacts. Now Flex does it one way, Anon does it a different way, and you've got some others. Again, remember we talked about the theory of the design of the radio. So you'll have these little differences among radios. But let me try to address the question. And back when Flex had their 1500, 3000, and 5000, that was done in the host computer, and you had a USB connection for the 1500, or what was then popular, a FireWire hardware connection to the computer. A much bigger data bus and lots more data could go back and forth. Well, if you had a computer that maybe wasn't as powerful. The CPU wasn't as fast. You didn't have as much RAM. Maybe the hard disk was a slow one of 5,400 RPM as opposed to one with 7,000 or 10,000 or what have you. It would lag behind and you get stuttering and you would get some things. Now, to the extent that that is involved in the transmit noise, I guess it would have an impact. But look at what happened when Flex went to their 6,000. And this is where some users get confused. It's flipped the model. It's what's called in computing a client-server model. When you access a Flex, even if you get one, the M model, like the 6400M with a screen and a knob, that's just a little separate computer physically attached to the radio. That is a Linux server in a box. And so it's doing the computational dynamics, and you have a client, whether it's your PC, your iPad, or even a Maestro, which is basically a little tablet computer with knobs, or on the front of one of the radios, it's a separate one. So that flipped it, and the reason for that is they could get just absolutely much faster and better data processing of the volume of the IQ data, which is the heart of an SDR. Oh, but then look at some other designs like the newer Yaesus, where they have an SDR front end, but it's followed by a superhet design. And many would argue that you get superior filtering there. I can't make that argument from an engineering standpoint, but I have an FTDX10 and I have a 6400, and they're both darn good receivers from my vantage point. On the transmit side, I can't really say. Clearly, what the questioner's asking works on the receive side. You get better performance as you get better computational capability. But on the transmit side, I'm just not sure. But remember, the filtering, a lot of it in the SDR is, in fact, done in the software. Remember when they sold the original ones, you'll never have to buy filters again. It'll all be in software. And they have a brick wall. That was one of the early advertising labels with the brick wall. Now, we'll tell you here, the Anon Apache, they have a particular ability to use what's called pure signal, and they use pre-distortion to handle receive noise. I'm not sure what that does on the transmit. There's the capability for Flex to do it in the hardware, but I don't believe they have implemented it yet. Mike Walker, who is on the Ham Radio Workbench podcast and in a group that I meet with on Saturday mornings called Cycle 25, he can't say some things because he's an employee, but he says that's coming. So I think the questioner is spot on, and it does make a difference, and different SDR designs differ in how they approach that problem.
Okay, Frank, yeah, thank you. So just part two kind of Mike G4GUG's point. He says, I am assuming that PA linearity has matured. And with analog radios, he also says that it was mixers and filtering. But anyway, on PA linearity, is that pretty perfect? You know, as good as it's going to get, I guess, is what he's asking there.
Well, I'm not sure my opinion's worth hearing on that, just in terms of my own competence. But let me make some observations. Even with well-known manufacturers, let's take Kenwood. When the TS590S was released, it was their next generation radio. In fact, they still market it that way. If you look at their advertisements, I'm sure it's the same in Radcom. I'm a member of RSGB, and I read Radcom as soon as it drops. I get it digitally. So that was their next generation, even though they've gotten some more radios out there. What was the one problem that it had? It had an overshoot problem in that you may turn the power down below 100 watts because you're driving an amplifier. You may have it down at 40 watts, for example. And as soon as you keyed up, it didn't stop at 40 watts. It fired off to its maximum and then came back down. Well, what happened in the amplifier? Well, it fired off you were overdriving that amplifier. Now, I'm using that just as a case in point. That's a question of linearity in how it's implemented. So I can't really speak to the linearity of all of the transmitters. I think things among the major manufacturers have certainly got dramatically better. But you have to look at PA linearity in how you use it. And often it's used with amplifiers. And, the old standard of using ALC to control that has kind of gone by the wayside. I don't think even Flex recommends that you use that. Most of the amplifiers that they've got, they have enough capability, or smarts as they like to call it, to communicate with the radio, so they manage that themselves. I didn't really give a full answer on that, and I apologize. But I do think there have been real improvements. Home brewers that build their own from kits and things, just take Astor Forhand's Micro BitX. And I don't know the answer to this, but take a Micro BitX and put it on a good bench and measure the linearity of that output with a spec analyzer against, say, an ICOM 7300 or any one of the middle of the pack HF transceivers. And I think what you'll see is that the Micro BitX would not have the linearity. I could be wrong, but my guess is that it would not. And so you can see the major manufacturers have probably gotten it to a pretty good level for most use cases.
Sure. Okay, Frank. Thank you. Do take a drink, please, because it's quite a marathon session for you. Got a couple of other questions for you. I hope that's all right to continue with those. Jim G3YLA says, very absorbing data, Frank. In your view of the rigs tested, what shows as the main determinant for the transmit quality in the rig architecture?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag. And I will tell you, let's look. I mean, I've been using software-defined radios for about 15 years, okay? And so I bought a Perseus when it came out of Italy and early on. So I've been using SDRs. I'm not new to SDRs. Now, that's on the receive side. So I'm very familiar with them. But look at Flex for a moment. And you've got 3 of their radios. And you noticed that there was a dramatic difference between their entry-level 6400, which I have, and their flagship 6700. Well, I don't know the nuances of the internal architecture well enough to speculate, but clearly, even within the same ABC models of the same manufacturer, there were measurable differences in composite noise. Okay, that's point number one. Look at the slight differences among the Elecraft radios. Now, I will say that Wayne Burdick, the design engineer, had the virtue of only having one radio to work on, right? I mean, they had the K3, the K3S, and now the K4D, and so on. So when you're focused, you can see the results of that work as it, not dramatically, but continuously got a little better. And with the K4D, that design changed as well with an SDR capability. We don't have in these data but one Anon, so we only have the Apache 7000. I haven't looked at any data for the 8000. We just don't have it. And this is one of the inhibitions where the ARL, they consider that part of their data proprietary and they won't release it, and they do these fuzzy graphics. So we have a hard time comparing. So we really don't know. Sometimes in the world of quality control statistics, or QC, Edward Deming helped rebuild Ford Motor Company after it almost went out of business. And everybody follows the Edward Deming quality control protocol for testing products, no matter what the products are. Now, if you think about it in that perspective, you've got to have multiple designs to compare them. And in the data that I presented with 21, you've got enough with ICOM and you got enough with Elecraft. You got probably enough with Flex. You don't have with Anon. With Yaesu, you do. So if you look at, there was a big difference among even the same general class of Flex radios and transmit noise. Look at the difference in the designs of the Yaesu back with the earlier FT models, 1000 and 2000. They were in Jim Brown's data that he was able to talk ARL out of. Now he's lost those data. I asked for them, and the laptop computer crashed, and he no longer has it. So clearly, those data, those measurements were different. And the newer radios, the Yaesu, incorporated an SDR design along with a superhet design. So all that is to say that yes, design seems to have an effect. Clearly, it has an effect. Now, the nuances of specifically what each one does, I can't really tell you, except as I've just stated, that clearly it does have an effect. It's not unique to the manufacturer. We were able to see Elecraft plodding along with the same design and incrementally making it better. So I wish I had the data to give a better answer, David.
No, that's a good answer, and actually closely linked to that, our final question from a viewer, Malcolm G3PDH, who says, a very interesting talk. Is the reason that Elecraft comes out well because they are dedicated? They're a dedicated amateur radio supplier versus maybe the Japanese rig being a spin-off from their other commercial products?
That is a great question, and as many of the listeners would know, and hams at large know, Yaesu was affiliated with Land Mobile. Kenwood was. They sort of get married and get divorced with that. And so ICOM clearly is influenced with their R&D from their Land Mobile. In fact, our representative, Ray Novak, that was the ham radio only rep, has now moved into Land Mobile, and they have a younger person now who's superb that handles amateur radio, or handles a lot of amateur radio at rallies and Hamfest. ICOM clearly recycles their design. Now, what do I mean by that? If you take a IC 7300, which I have, a 705, which I have, a 9700, 2 meter, 70 sims, and 1.2 gigahertz, which I have, you know the menu. You don't. If you know one of them, you don't have to study the menu. And in fact, the 7300 and the 705, I think the 9700, but I can't say for sure, it's the actual same screen. So when you think about it, you got 3 radios, and you need to order, 300,000 screens because you're going to use them in 3 different radios. They'll sell differently. The 7300 sold a lot. So you can get a really good cost per item, cost per unit there. And then you're recycling a lot of that R&D technology. Well, if you know you're going to design a new radio, say the 9700, and now the 905, and if you look at it, it looks like a 705 with an external box that goes up your mast to keep the transmitter close to the antenna to cut losses, you're recycling that, you're saving money and R&D time, and then you can focus on what some problems have been. So I think ICOM on the one hand is a bigger manufacturer taking R&D from Land Mobile radios and applying it to their amateur stuff versus a small shop like Elecraft that's gone from K3, K3S, K4D. And they were, a year and a half, maybe even 2 years, somewhere in that period of time, late on getting the K4 out because, they're a small shop and they had a lot of stuff in R&D. So I think the questioner has a great point. It can be carried out in different ways, as I've illustrated with ICOM and Elecraft. Now, Kenwood has not released something in a while, and a lot of hams say, oh, they're out of the business. Oh, well, they really aren't. They still sell what they sell. They've never had a proliferation of radios, whether it was in VHF, UHF, bands, or an HF. Now, whether they get out of the ham radio market remains to be seen. They're no longer present in Australia, but who knows? So I'm not sure what they do. Yaesu is doing a lot of innovation. And when they decided to compete with Flex by going with a superhet in addition to an SDR design, it was taking a chance. But look at what happened. They got to be the first 100 dB narrow dynamic range radio to ever hit the market. Bingo. So I'm not being hopefully too wishy-washy in what I'm saying. I'm trying to address the question of how the affiliation with Land Mobile affects the amateur radio products. Now, the Elecraft is the small, more artisan-like shop, very focused on one radio, with their QRP radios. Notice that their KX1 in earlier days, but KX2 and KX3 on receive measure out at the very top. The KX3 measures out on Sherwood's test at the very top. It's just a QRP radio. And then they came out with a KPA 100 amplifier. I have one of those too. I use it with my 705, to make it a 100-watt radio. So I think the questioner has a great point, and you can see the breadcrumbs of how different manufacturers carry out their R&D reciprocity, if you will, taking from one radio and putting it in another.
Yeah, and plus, of course, they need to differentiate with different levels of cost and everything else. And I personally, I guess as well, that with the advent of software doing so much more, they can control and tweak the specifications between the models a lot easier and lower cost, because it doesn't really cost
and
anything.
If you notice, when ICOM has a firmware update on a 705, there's usually one with a 7300, or they've got a 7300 and it'll be a 705. It may or may not be the 9700. It just depends, but you'll notice a similarity there.
There's a common architecture and probably an economy of scale in both in terms of how many they make, but also the three models being similar. So it can only be good.
Well, and with the 905.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the 905 now, my hat's off to them. This is very shrewd, and unless hams tire of the interface, I don't think they will. It's a virtue to sit down and go, oh, it's one of these four. I already know how to use it.
Sure.
If Yaesu could conquer that with the reaction to all their menus, that's the big negative that some hams have. If they could emulate that in some fashion, so there is a homogeneity in their menu structure, it would keep the radios like their 101 from getting lower ratings, because that's the kickback, is it's complicated.
Sure. And I guess what we have to learn from it, as you said, I mean, you alluded to maybe the magazines, and let's not name them because we don't have to attribute anything to any of them in particular, but that maybe the magazines kind of have a vested interest. They've got to keep their advertisers sweet, but they also want to produce honest and objective and open reviews. And I guess the main problem might be to find a set of results and specifications that all of the manufacturers would feel would be fair for a lab to test on, and that might be the challenge. But maybe Rob Sherwood might hold the key, because he's been independent, as you say, for a long time and seems to be universally respected. So maybe that shows the way. Anyway, Frank, I think we've...
Well, David, let me just add this. This is not unique to ham radio. I began my career in the news business, in radio news, and I had written for newspapers. You have newspapers and radio and TV stations, the advertisement department, the same thing with the news department. They have a conflict when a particular news story that might affect the manufacturer. Here in the States right now, we had a train derailment in the northeastern part, and a lot of toxic chemicals, have come out. Well, imagine the TV station covering that, but you don't have railroads advertising much, grant you, but maybe the company that's being hurt by the news is a big advertiser. Well, the conversations in the back room that go on. So this is not unique to amateur radio, but your point is well taken. I think Rob Sherwood's an international treasure, and his independence sort of speaks for itself. And if anything I do helps amplify the data he produces, then I'm honored to do that.
Well, I think it has, Frank. What I haven't read out to you are all the compliments and thanks from everybody, and I'm not going to just single any of them out. They're there to see online. But thank you very much indeed, Frank, because you have made all those figures make sense. That graph was quite a head scratch, and we certainly, I don't think, could have made sense of that and all of the other data without you disseminating it to us. So thank you ever so much for tonight's talk. It's been really good to see you again.
Well, listen, I want to make a compliment to your club. I have a single finger gesture of my feelings for your club, and I'm going to show it to you.
Oh, thank goodness for that. Well, we're very grateful.
My niece gave me my niece gave me the world's greatest uncle with a thumbs up, and you clearly have a terrific club, and you have a good a joie de vivre, I think is the French might say. You have a good ethos and a good culture. And it's been my honor to speak to you twice now recently. So thank you much.
Thank you ever so much, Frank. Thanks a lot. There we are. And we know now about transmitters, and because it is something that actually, you think about all the reviews and things that we've seen and we've heard people talk about. Mainly it is about the receive, because that's the bit we see. And I think that's my theory of why, it's not been looked at before. So let's hope that will help with reviews. I hope you've enjoyed that tonight. Just to go over then a little bit of a review of what's happening at the club. Sunday, it's the GBTRS News, 7 o'clock, GB3MB. Monday, 7:30 on GB3MB. It's our regular Monday night net. And at 8 o'clock, the 80 meter CW net on 3.543 megahertz. And then next Wednesday, we won't be here online. We'll be in person at CNS School, where the RSGB are going to give us a presentation on brickworks. And we'll be back here on NARC Live in 2 weeks' time tonight. And between now and then, please keep sending your news and your pictures and your views. And if you'd like to send a card to anybody, let us know. But that's it for tonight's NARC Live. Been good to see you. So from Tammy M0TC.
Bye-bye.
And from me, David G7ERP. Take care of yourselves and look after each other. Bye-bye.